Okay, hello everybody. My name is Kathy Hurley, and I'm the Authors Group Manager here at the Union League Club. And yes, I am at the Union League Club. However, Amy Stanley, who is our author, is not. She is virtually joining us from your home, I'm gathering, Amy. That's where you're at in Evanston. Yes, thank you so much, Amy, and we really appreciate your spending an hour in this beautiful afternoon and to talk about your new book. How exciting.
Right here.
There it is. Oh, very good. I'm so glad you had it to put it up so our listeners can see what the book looks like. And also, I wanted to remind everybody, if you do and would like to purchase a book I already told Amy I'm going to purchase this for one of my dear friends whose mother is from Japan. So I know she'd really enjoy this book. I'm going to get it for her for a gift, and then I'm buying one for my summer read to go up north in August. So I hope that the rest of you are thinking in terms of how you can purchase this book. You can call the bookstall in Winnetka, and you can also reach them online too by the www.thebookstall.com, and they would be happy to provide you with a book. And then Amy, I think you signed some plates for them that they're going to include in the book, and they'll also ship it to you, or they have curbside service too if you want to go in Winnetka and pick it up and take a nice drive over there in Winnetka and see the folks at the bookstall. So Amy, I just wanted to start off a little bit and talk about your wonderful career and the fact that you graduated from Harvard with a PhD in 2007. Yay! It's always good to graduate, right? And you're also at Northwestern University here in Chicago, and you are a professor in history. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So, and you've written quite a few books, and I'll go ahead and talk a little bit, but your special interest is about women's and their gender history and more global history. And your first book is Selling Women, Prostitution, Households, and the Market in Early Modern Japan.
Yes.
Boy, I bet that was tough to research. And also, you also explored about the sex, what was it, expanding market for sex transformed the Japanese economy and how it changed the women's lives during that period of time in 1868. So we're going to talk about the period of Edo, is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So this book takes place during the first half of the 19th century. And it was during a time where there was a real dramatic shift between the agricultural community, which is what they were predominantly, and then the upper class, and then shoguns, right? Is that the different classes that they had?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. So when you talk about the 19th century in Japan, you have to split it in half at 1868, because before 1868, you have the shogun, you have samurai, you have a predominantly agricultural society, and you have a society that is in many ways closed to much of the outside world. Then there's a major break in 1868 called the Restoration, where Japan opens and transforms, and the emperor becomes the kind of figurehead of the government, and has the actual, and in fact actually has power over the government, and the shogunate is abolished. So my book is the first half of the 19th century. So it is the Japan that is relatively isolated, that has a class of about 10% of people are samurai, who are the samurai that you think of, who have the top knots and they carry two swords, and they are warriors. And they think of themselves as warriors because they're descended from people who fought in Japan's civil wars hundreds of years earlier. But the paradox about them is that even though they're warriors and they're in charge of this whole society because they are warriors, they have had 268 years of peace. So none of them has ever fought a war. And by the time my story takes place and Sununu is born in 1804, this is a country that is ruled by samurai who do not fight, and they are bureaucrats mostly, in a society that's been at peace for centuries. But of course, in the middle of the 19th century, all of that is going to change. So she lives my protagonist, Sununu, lives at this time when Japan is about to change, and she's the last generation to live in this lost world.
But she's also a woman that is looking to be modern, more of a modern woman, correct?
Yes.
So she also is trying to ditch that sense of what society wanted her to be, and yet she wants to be a modern woman in the city and leave her village.
Yes. So this is the really important problem of Tsuneno's life. So Sununu, my protagonist, was born in 1804, as I said, and she was born in this tiny village in Japan's snow country. It is now modern Niigata Prefecture on the Japan Sea coast, but it's known colloquially as the snow country because it's one of the snowiest places in the world. So this is a region where several feet of snow could fall overnight, where people had to climb to the roofs of their houses every day and shovel them off because otherwise the snow would collapse them.
Wow, that's like up north in Wisconsin.
Yes, it's just like Wisconsin. And
Right.
in fact, still in this region, unfortunately, every bad winter, there are reports of people who are injured because they're shoveling their rooftops. So they still really get a lot of snow. When I visited last time I was there, my guide, who is a professor at a local university, told me that we went back to this village, which is now a city, where Tsuneno was born. And the area of the city where she was born is still agricultural. There's still rice fields. And she told me that the roads now through this part of the countryside that used to be her village are heated so that the snow that falls on them will melt. Because otherwise the snow falls so thick and so fast and it blows through the rice field so much that you can't even see the road to drive on.
Wow.
So this is a very kind of severe and difficult place to live, especially in the world without, good snow boots and steel snow shovels and snow plows. So people in this region had a really hard life. And in the winters, the snow would basically trap them in their houses. They'd have to dig tunnels in order to get out and walk around. And they knew that it was a very difficult place to make a living. And so it was generally quite poor. But Sununu, who was born into this environment, was much better off than most of her neighbors because her family was Buddhist priests. And that meant that they ran a temple and they got donations from parishioners. And so that she could be very educated. She learned to read and write and sew and all the kind of polite accomplishments of a well-bred young lady. And she learned all this because her parents expected that her fate in life would be to go and be married to a priest like her father. And they married her off when she was 12 years old.
Ooh.
I know, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
but that's quite common for that area and that point in time.
It was somewhat unusual because I know her parents said in their letters that, it's, we know that she's very young to be a bride, but it wasn't unheard of. Her aunt had married at 12 as well. So this is something that could happen. It was just considered a little bit on the young side. And she was sent to another household in a different province, way far away from her family, and an even more northern, snowier place. And that was supposed to be her life. But she only lasted 15 years there. I mean, only 15 years.
Only, yeah, that's a long time. Yeah.
27, she was divorced and sent home. And amazingly, she married again and was divorced, and married again and was divorced. And then she decided, I can't take this anymore. I would rather die than get married again. She actually writes in her letters. And she ran away to make a different and new life for herself in the city. And so that struggle of this woman's life to kind of determine her own future, to not do what her family expected of her, to escape this endless cycle of arranged marriage, is the story that's at the heart of the book.
So what inspired you about Sununu? How did you come across her, and what made you think, you know what, I'm going to write an entire novel around this woman?
Yes. So Sununu I found in a very strange way. I was an assistant professor at Northwestern in my second year, and I was trying to find materials to assign to my students. And I had all sorts of kind of, conventional types of documents about samurai and the military and the government and all of the things that historians usually consider very important. But
Mhm.
I wanted my students to read more about ordinary life and ordinary people.
Right.
The problem was that there wasn't much translated into English, and my students at Northwestern can't necessarily read 19th century Japanese, right? So I was looking online to see if there were things that I could find that I could translate and then assign to them so they would understand what village life was like. So I went onto the website of the archive in Niigata Prefecture, which is where Tsuneno is from, although I did not know that yet. And I looked, and they had an internet document lecture series, which introduced all of their important or interesting documents to the public. And they chose
Wow.
the document and a little transcription of the document because the documents were handwritten and even ordinary Japanese people can't read them. So there would be an image and a transcription and then an explanation. So this is what this document is about. This is what it says. And I clicked on episode 12 and I read this letter, and it completely blew me away. And it was Tsuneno, who was writing home to her mother from the great city of Edo, which is now Tokyo. And she was saying, the first line of the letter said, I'm writing with spring greetings. As you know, I went to Edo and I ended up in so much trouble. And just from there, I was completely intrigued and I had to read the rest. And she starts chatting about how she was working for a very wealthy merchant and how he was building a special room for his concubine who was a geisha from Kyoto, and how he had so much money, and how she was spending pocket money on food, and she'd found the best hair oil, and that everything in Edo was delicious. So it's this very kind of bubbly, excited letter. And it reminded me of myself writing email home from Tokyo when I was a student, right, and had first gotten there in 1997. So I was determined to know more about this woman. And the explanation from the archive said that there were 100 more letters from her that they had in their collection. And so knowing this was a revelation for me because I'd never heard somebody from this period, the early 1800s, sound so modern, so up to date, like somebody you could talk to. So I flew to Japan and I went to the archive and I took pictures of every single one of her letters, which were kind of folded up accordion style.
So you did all this while you're an associate professor at Northwestern.
Well, I was an assistant professor at Northwestern.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
The other part of the story, which is interesting, is that I flew to Japan to take pictures of these documents.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the worst jet lag I'd ever had in my life. And I thought, you can see in the initial pictures that I took of the documents with my camera, you can see my little hand gripping the table and my white knuckles because I just felt like I might collapse. And it turned out that although I didn't know it, I was pregnant with my first child. So
oh, no.
I know
my gosh.
how long it took to write this book because I can date it. My older son just turned 10.
Yes.
10 years of research.
How long did you research a baby and a child that way? Yeah.
Exactly. 2 children by the end of
Goodness.
it.
So you did get to travel to Japan. So how long did you stay there during that period doing that research?
Well, during that research, I didn't stay for very long. So the first time I went for about, so I lived in Japan before when I was doing my PhD.
Oh, okay.
I lived in Osaka for a while, and then I lived in Tokyo for a year. And that's
how did you develop that first love for Amy, for Japan? I mean, how did you develop? You're at Harvard, you're a student, you're like, that's it, I'm going to Japan. I love Japan. I mean, where did that come from?
Well, actually, for me, it came from my childhood because my father was a physician scientist at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And he had a lab, and he had all sorts of postdocs coming to his lab to do research, and many of them in the 1980s were from Japan. Mm-hmm. And so when I was young, I grew up around a lot of Japanese people, many of them who had come straight from Tokyo. And in the 1980s, Tokyo was incredibly glamorous. I mean, It still is, but in the 80s, it was the bubble era, and everybody was talking about Japan. Mm-hmm. And I was so interested in this very different place. And when I got to college, I decided to take the Japanese language because it was something that wasn't offered in high school.
That
And
was my next question, if you knew how to speak it and write it, because in order to do this kind of research and to dig up the old documents that you were able to look about Sununu, I mean, how did you had to read Japanese somewhat and speak it?
yes, so this was my problem. So I read and speak modern Japanese, but the Japanese of the 19th century is very
Was,
different.
yeah.
And not only is it 19th century Japanese, but it's 19th century Japanese in handwriting. And the manuscript, the handwriting, doesn't look like the printed characters that you would see, like, in a kind of like this would look like printed characters that we can
Right, right.
but the handwritten characters look like something like this. They're all squiggles.
Like script, like what our script handwriting would
Yeah,
be
like
as
cursive.
opposed to printing.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
it is the cursive style, right? So
right.
I had to use this special dictionary in order to look up the shapes of the characters in order to figure out what these letters said. And that was the hardest part of doing the research, was just the basic question of, what does this say? And then once I know what it says, what does it mean? Because
Right.
not only were the letters all squiggles, Sununu also wrote in a local dialect. So
Oh,
she didn't
wow.
sound like a standard Tokyo person. So I spent many hours at my desk with my computer trying to read the letters out loud to see if I could figure out what they sounded like so that I could read them.
Oh my gosh, just hearing you say that just gets me more excited to really get into this book and read it. Just knowing that is so difficult in and of itself to do that kind of research and then to go ahead and write a story in English about it. It's amazing. That's just amazing. So I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So you told us how you developed the love for Sununu, but now what about the other characters? I mean, how did you relate her Buddhist father, and how did you develop those characters?
So the sources that I used to write her story came from her family's archives. So her family ran a Buddhist temple and they kept all of their papers. So they kept diaries, they kept shopping lists, they kept incoming correspondence, the way that we will keep letters that we receive, but they also kept copies of their outgoing correspondence, which was really important. So I'd have both sides of a letter chain, right? And so from all of these documents, there were, I think, 3,000 or so in the collection, maybe 4,000. I didn't have to look at all of them, but I had to look at hundreds of them to piece together the relationships. So I'll talk about two of my favorite of the characters in this story. One is Sununu's brother. Sununu's brother was very much unlike her in the sense that he was very conventional. And he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He grew up and he inherited his father's temple and he became the head priest. And he got married to a woman named Sano and had many children, and one of them succeeded him after he died. So he had this very, he was a patriarch. He had an unimpeachable life according to the standards of that time, whereas Sununu was the one who was always in trouble. And the relationship between the two of them is very important to the book because he is trying to be in charge of this family. He's trying to get her safely married off. He's trying to protect the family's reputation. And she has this fierce desire for independence. And she's
Right.
always messing it up. So the two of them really go at it in their letters. They can never see eye to eye. He calls her selfish. He says all sorts of, he quotes Confucian classics at her, like kind of moralizing that you're not behaving the way you're supposed to. And he cuts her off from the family at one point. So they're always fighting. But they also, you can tell from the letters, really loved each other. That he was upset that she'd abandoned the family and had caused all this trouble, but he didn't want to let her go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's their correspondence that really makes up the sources that I used for the book, because they talked to each other a lot. They wrote to each other a lot, and they were faithful in writing to each other even when they didn't agree. So it's that contrast is one of the major stories of the book. Another really intriguing character is Sununu's last husband. Sununu's last husband was this guy named Hirosuke, and he had also come from her same region of the snow country. But they met when she ran away to the city, which is now Tokyo, the city of Edo, and she hadn't seen him in over 20 years. So he had been like a childhood friend of hers.
Yeah.
And he was there pretending to be a samurai, basically. He had been a boy from the countryside. He was a peasant. But in the early 19th century, young men would run to the city and try to improve their lot in life by pretending to be samurai and trying to get hired by other samurai, like as bodyguards or as martial arts instructors or as enforcers. And so this guy, Hirosuke, the hometown boy, was trying to make his life in the city just as she was. So they got married, which was completely against everybody's advice. Everybody told her not to do it, but she must have liked him, or she felt more secure having a husband, so she married him anyway. But the problem with Hirosuke is he had a horrible temper, and he was always unemployed. And she would write things in her letters like, all he does, when we run out of money, all he does is sleep. And then when we have money, he just orders out his favorite food. It sounds like a lazy man.
Sounds like today, right?
Like somebody complaining about their lazy husband. So unsurprisingly, after a few years of this, she divorced him and went home. But the twist in the story is, and forgive me, there are no spoilers in history, so I'm not spoiling it. He asked her to marry him again. And she went back and remarried him. And he finally got a job with a very famous city magistrate so that she could be a respectable samurai woman by the end of her life. Yeah, so
it's nice.
It's a love story. It is kind of a very
little romance involved.
Yeah. How often do you find somebody who gets married 5 times and the last 2 are to the same person? I found that incredibly interesting.
And during that period of time, I mean, how did she get divorced during that period of time? I mean, I didn't even, because I can remember divorce when my parents got divorced, and it was a big deal. I can only imagine, how big of a deal it was during then.
So one of the really surprising things about Japan in this era is that people got divorced all the time. And if you think about it, it's easy to understand why. So the reason is that people lived with their in-laws generally. So you would typically, you can see where I'm going with this.
A lot of friction. Yep.
Can you imagine living with your in-laws? Some of us have done it. So basically you would bring in a bride or a groom to live with your family and then take over the family business, whatever it was, whether it was a temple or a store or a farm. Mm-hmm. And that meant that if the person you married your son to was someone you didn't get along with, or somebody who you felt was incompetent, or somebody who just didn't fit into your family, you had a real problem, because not only did you have to live with her, you had to trust her to take over the family enterprise in the future. And the only solution to that intractable problem was to let people get divorced and keep trying to find somebody who would fit into your family. So there were a lot of people who got divorced and remarried. The problem, though, was that for women couldn't technically initiate a divorce. The divorce had to come from a letter from one's husband. And sometimes a woman would really want to divorce, but she couldn't get one because the husband wouldn't write out the letter. This actually happens to Sununu in her last marriage. The husband refused to write the letter and refused to give it to her. So what do you do in that scenario? So
you fake it.
Yes, well, if you can write, you could fake your divorce letter, but that would get you in a lot of trouble. So typically there were 2 things you could do. Sununu doesn't end up having to resort to either of these things, but one thing you could do is get your family to intervene. And you can get your father or your brother to lean on your husband and say, come on, give this woman a divorce. The other thing you could do was go to a special divorce temple. And these were places that would offer you asylum. So women, once they entered the gates of the divorce temple, if they stayed there for a specific amount of time, they would get their divorce free and clear, and the temple would guarantee it. Now, the problem was you had to get to the divorce temple in order to claim asylum. And so there are stories of women running to the gates of the divorce temple with their husbands in hot pursuit, kind of grabbing at their kimono. But the rule was if you got one sandal into the precincts of the temple, then you were home free. So there are also stories of women who know they're not going to make it, and they take off the sandal and they chuck it of the temple, and if the sandal lands they're
Oh,
home free and they can get their divorce.
oh, that's a great story. It's
Yeah.
a great story. So Amy, where do you write? Do you write in your home, or do you have a favorite place that inspires you?
I write every place I possibly can. So I had two babies while I was writing this book. And like many young children, probably like many boys in particular, my kids had this kind of automatic response to the sound of my laptop opening, which is they would come, crawl into my lap, and slam it closed right away. So that meant that it was very hard for me to write at home.
Mhm.
So I did a lot of writing in my office at Northwestern. But then sometimes I would get inspired when I was at home, and or when I was like in the middle of a birthday party or at a playground, or we have a play space in Evanston called Little Beans, an indoor play space where, and then I would just pick up my phone and write paragraphs on the phone.
Wow.
And
Wow.
actually, some of my favorite parts of the book are
Wow.
paragraphs that I wrote on my phone while I was rocking kids to sleep, or
Right.
standing in a corner of a birthday party or something like that. So it's a complicated answer, but I can actually go through this book and think, oh, this part I wrote in my office and this part I wrote on my phone.
That's great. That's good to know. So I think you mentioned the brother as being one of your favorite characters in the book. I think you said you had one more, and I might have
It's her
interrupted
husband.
you.
Yeah, her
Oh, her
number
husband,
one.
Hito. That's
Yeah.
right. All right, you did finish that thought. So, all right, we established you kind of right all over it, and I think that's kind of funny because, I often hear a lot of mothers are sitting there nursing their babies, that's an inspiration, that they automatically grab their phone and go, oh, I forgot this, or it's a good
Yeah.
time to kind of settle your thoughts and get
Yes.
your thoughts together,
Yes.
I guess I
My
could
blue
say.
nursing chair upstairs is where I wrote some of the paragraphs of this
See,
book.
see, honestly. So you grew up in Chicago, in Evanston, in that area, or no?
No, I didn't. I grew up in Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So
Thus Harvard. Yeah.
I was a complete newcomer to the Midwest when I came in 2007. And it was a big adjustment, in some ways, a bigger adjustment than Tokyo, to go from the East Coast to the Midwest. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
only now, after having lived here for a long time, feel like I'm actually a
A
Chicago,
Midwesterner.
a
You're a
Midwesterner.
Chicago girl.
Well,
Yep.
part of it is having my kids be born here. They're
Right.
definitely Midwesterners and Cubs fans, and they've never known any place else. So just have to give into it.
You have to release your Eastern accent a little bit
Yes,
too.
exactly.
Um, let's see. We will open it up to the audience to get some more questions, but I wanted to ask you one more thought. So while you're in Tokyo, what is your favorite thing about Tokyo?
I love everything about Tokyo. I love that it's a big, exciting city, but it's also really orderly. I love the subways, I love the trains, I love the tall buildings, but I think my favorite thing about Tokyo is almost everyone's favorite thing about Tokyo, and that is the food.
Yeah.
So I am a huge fan of Japanese food, and particularly sushi. And everybody knows that the best sushi in the whole world is in Tokyo. And so that is what I absolutely must do while I'm there, is get myself some really good sushi, and then other kinds of varieties of Japanese noodles,
Mhm.
or tonkatsu, like fried pork, yakitori, like grilled chicken. So
Mhm.
I think actually that Tokyo has the best food in the entire world. Sorry, Chicago. And that's one of the reasons I'll always go back.
Where do you get your sushi in Chicago?
That is a really good question. So I used to go to a place called Katsu on the far north side, and
Mhm.
then it closed. That was kind of a legendary sushi place that catered to a lot of visiting businessmen and kind of expats.
Mhm.
And then I was going to a place called Naoki in, it was in a hotel in the, near Lincoln Park, in the Lincoln
Oh,
Hotel, I think. But you
right.
had to go through a kitchen to get there. It was very kind of hidden away, but that closed. So now I need to find a new good sushi place.
I always go to Shaw's. Shaw's is like my favorite place for sushi. However, it's probably not as original as what you would think it is. But anyways, so at this time, I think we could probably open this up for some questions from our audience, our listeners. If anyone has a question, please post it in the chat, and we can ask Amy more questions about her book and her inspirations. Oh, I do have one more question too about this. If you were not writing a historical novel, what other genre would you write?
So that is actually the genre I would write. So this book actually, though it reads, people have said that it reads like a novel, like it reads like fiction. It's entirely true because I'm
True.
a historian,
Yeah.
so I have to footnote everything, and it's
I
all
sit
that.
corrected. You're right. You're right. You're
But
right.
if I could write something else, I would write historical fiction. I would write a
Yeah.
historical novel. Those are my favorite types of books to read. They have been since I was a child. And my problem is that I don't have enough imagination to come up with my own plot. So I can discover a really interesting person and write about her, but I'm not sure that I'm capable of imagining not just the world, but also the life of the person from scratch. But maybe for some other lifetime, or maybe when I'm retired, that's what I'll do.
But I think it's even more difficult doing what you did. I mean, that real detailed research is very difficult to do. I think it's easier just to dream something up in your head and create it as real. I mean, to really
Yeah.
dig deep and find something that is historically real and write about it, you're striving to be accurate, correct?
Yes, and I have to be accurate and all the details have to be right. And there I was really helped by the fact that Japan was such a literate society and there's so many documents remaining and there's so many images remaining, woodblock prints and illustrated books, so that I was able to really recreate that world in a kind of vivid and specific detail that
Hmm.
we can't get actually for other places. So if you tried to write this book about 19th century New York or London or
Right.
Paris, I think you would have actually less information and less to go on and less detail than you have someplace like Japan.
Well, and do you think the culture kind of lended itself to that too, Amy? You said they were orderly and that was kind of that is how their culture ran. The fact that they even had copies of those letters that just blows me away. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a society that ran on record keeping, and
Hmm.
everybody was kind of hyper conscious of the documents they had and what they were leaving behind for the next generation. Because if you think of these households kind of moving forward in time,
Right,
the new daughter-in-law needs to know what the mother did, how she
right,
did it, right?
right.
How do you make those pickles, right? And when guests come, which plates do we use? And how do we arrange the furniture? And what is in the storehouse? And all of those things people
Keep
wrote
everything orderly and the same and
and
yeah.
the same, so you have continuity. And then people also were very litigious. They'd be suing each other all the time over things, and they need to produce documentation. So that's two different kinds of documentation. But one, I think the litigiousness came first. So
Right.
official records came first. And so
Yeah.
everybody had to learn to write in order to defend their property, right? So rich people had to know how to write.
Hmm.
And then after they learned how to write, they figured out how useful writing was for other things, for writing a diary or poems or, instructions to your descendants. So there is this incredible volume of written material,
Hmm.
so much that it's not all orderly and cataloged. People still find this stuff in their houses, in their attics, and don't know what to do with it because they can't read it. So one of the jokes that my professor in Japan used to tell was that you need two things in order to be a very good historian of early modern Japan. One is that you need to be able to drink, and the other is that you need to be able to drive a car. Because what you need to do is you need to drive out into the countryside where people have these documents. Then you need to go out drinking with them to convince them to give you the documents, and then drive the documents home so that you can read them.
Oh, that's funny. I think the same goes for Ireland too.
Huh, probably.
Yeah. One of our members has a question. Jeannie Soa has a question, and this is a good one. I don't think we expanded on this. Did Sununu have any children?
She never did have children.
It's
And
amazing, all those marriages, and she didn't have any children.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about why. Um, it could be that she had miscarriages that aren't documented. It could even be, although I think this is a very remote possibility, that she did have a child in that first marriage who either died or never showed up in the letters because she left him or her behind. I
Hmm.
don't think that's the case. I think it's possible that she was infertile. It's also possible that she really didn't like men or sex, and she just wouldn't do it, and that's why she got divorced so many times. And one of the things about being a historian is you have to let yourself imagine all the possibilities, and then think through, based on what you know of that society, which one is the most likely. I think probably it's most likely that she couldn't have children. And the reason I think that is because, first of all, it would be hard to fend off that many husbands for that many years, right?
Right.
Like, actually,
or she's really good at it.
Really good at it. Really frightening, but not so frightening that they didn't try for 15 years or 4 years, or however long it was. And I think the other thing is that if you understand that society, it's not like our society in which we have children as a kind of a way of fulfilling ourselves in some way. Children were necessary to continue the family and to contribute to people's security in old age, because it wasn't like you were going to get a social security check from the shogunate, right? You needed your child to support you. And so people who could have children did. And so I think that in some ways, not having children might have been a real disappointment to her, and might have been a reason why many of her marriages failed, because the husbands wanted to have children and didn't want to adopt. But on the other hand, not having children was a kind of freedom for her too, because if she had left a child behind, I don't know whether she would have run away to the big city.
Yeah.
And at the end of her life, she did look into adopting a child. She wanted to adopt her niece, her brother.
I was just going to ask you, did her brother have children that she kind of was a pseudo mother to, or, that favorite aunt or something like that? Or,
she wrote back in her letter, she would send her nephews presents. And she would ask after her nieces. She sent them dolls. They lived together for a while in between her divorces. And she asked for custody of one of his daughters so that she could bring her up as her own daughter. The brother said no. He was not going to send his daughter, who'd been very carefully brought up in this temple in the snow country, off to the big city to live with the aunt who had the unstable marriage with the wild side.
Yeah,
that was not happening.
So what part of researching and writing the book gave you that really moment? Like, this is it. This is the big excitement, like the big question that finally got answered that you were looking for.
I will tell you my favorite moment of researching this book, which was also the most emotional, came almost at the very end. So I had been researching for 10 years and I taught myself how to read all of these letters, but I didn't know when Sununu was born. I didn't have an exact date. And I had come to realize that I was probably never going to know, that it just probably hadn't been written down. And it was a little bit of a problem for the book, but I knew when it was roughly, and so I just fudged it. And then I went back to do my fact checking at the very end. When I finished a whole draft of the book, I went back to the archive to check and make sure all my details were accurate. And I called up a document from the archive that I'd never seen before, and it was billed as a record of Tsunenu's brother's birth. So it was billed as Gyu's birth. And so I flipped through this record, and it's kind of a very conventional, the boy was born in 1800, and here are all the people who sent gifts, and it went on for pages about all the gifts that they brought for her brother. And I was thinking, typical, the brother gets a huge birth record,
revered,
younger sister.
Right.
And then I'm flipping pages, and there are a bunch of empty pages. And then in the back of this document, in a woman's handwriting, it said, Tsunenu's birth, 3rd month, 12th day. And it gave me the date that I was looking for, and also all the presents, fewer of them, that people had brought for her birth. And it was completely coincidental that I found it. It had been missing in the archive. And I was so moved by finally seeing that specific day and the evidence that she, had this life and this family that recorded her birth. And also that I could read it, after 10 years of struggling to read these documents, that I started actually crying in the archive, and I had to turn away to not splash my mascara tears all over this, this 19th century document. I was pretending to read some encyclopedias. And then I looked at it again and I thought, I hope I'm really right about this. So I brought it over to the archivist and I said, can you just confirm that this is what this says, that Sununu was born on this day? And they said, yes, that looks right. And they said, you really liked Sununu? I said, well, yeah, I spent about 10 years trying to follow the course of this woman's life. I guess I really do like her.
Oh my goodness. They probably were like, oh, here she comes again. She's
Yeah, no,
after,
it
yeah.
was funny because I would go to the archive and there would always be a few years between trips
Yeah,
because I was having babies and things.
right.
And so I'd come back and sometimes the personnel at the archive would have changed. And I went back once, probably like my third visit, to call up these documents again. And they were like, these documents about Sununu, foreign women are really interested in them. I thought, wait, who are the foreign women who are coming here to look at these documents about Sununu? It's pretty obscure. It was me, of course, right?
Oh, that's a great story. So one other question I have for you, when you're preparing to write, this is for the writers in our audience, when you're preparing to write and you have an idea, and then we already talked about that, you just, when the ideas come to you, so you don't really have an outline, but do you start with somewhat of an outline, or is it just kind of develop as you go through it?
I think I didn't start with an outline. I'm not a very good outliner. I
Yeah,
tend to write.
it's an art. Outlining is an art.
Yeah, I was always the person in school when the teacher would tell you, now you have to write an outline and then you have to have note cards. I couldn't do it that way. So I like to write and kind of gain momentum. And then at the end of the day, at the end of the page that I've stopped on, I'll write little notes to myself about where I'm going. And that way, when I pick it back up the next day or a few days later, I know where it was that I was supposed to start again and where I was going, and it was easier to pick it back up. But I am a big reviser. So I write
Oh, yeah,
really
yeah,
kind of messy first drafts.
right.
And then I take them and I, spend endless amounts of time rewriting all the sentences and
Yeah.
doing all the paragraphs and things like that.
I had an English teacher once that told me I was frustrated because I was like, I want my paragraph to look good right away. And I forgot what I was writing about. And he said, why? When it takes many, many paragraphs to write one paragraph. And then I was like, oh, you mean I have to constantly change it? And yes, yes. So I've
Yeah.
learned that lesson, that you have to constantly massage that idea until it really sounds the way you want it to sound.
Yeah, I think that's something that my students have a lot of trouble with, is the
Right.
idea that you can't just put something on a page and turn it in, or you can, but it's not going to be very good. You have to put it on the page and then think about it, and it takes longer than you think it will. So if you try to do it the night before, it's not going to work out as well as you think it will.
So have you, I'm sure you shared with your students that you've written this book and your journey. I mean, it's just amazing, your journey to write this book. Again, I'm so excited to really dig down deep and see all these great facts that you have dug up and put on paper. I mean, what do they think about, my teacher wrote this book?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned in writing this book was that students are really interested in ordinary people's lives.
Hmm.
And, I think a lot of them come in thinking of history as a story about great men and wars and famous names and dates. And they think that history is really boring because that's the way they learned it. And they just had to memorize a bunch of stuff and it didn't feel real to them. It was just kind of rote memorization. But when they realize that part of history can be excavating stories of ordinary unknown people
Right.
and thinking about what it was like to live in a 19th century Japanese village, or what it was like to live in Tokyo before it was Tokyo. What is it like to live in a really snowy place where the snow might collapse your roof unless you go up and you shovel it off every day? Those are the stories that really resonate with them. And I think it's because we are all ordinary people. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some famous people listening in today. I'm sorry if I've insulted you. But most of us are just ordinary anonymous people who will be lost to history someday.
Yeah.
And I think for my students especially, they're college students, they're in their early 20s usually, they're thinking about themselves and their place in the world and what they're going to do and what their life will mean. It's interesting for them to think about people who were in their circumstances, just kind of ordinary people trying to get through these big historical moments, or living in times that were incredibly challenging. And so while I was writing this book, I also teach global history. I teach the big survey to all of the Northwestern history majors that goes from 1500 to 1850 for the whole world.
Oh, wow.
I really revised that course to talk more about the experiences of common people, about women, about these figures who were just ordinary but got caught up in these extraordinary events. And I think that that really transformed who I was as a teacher. And I think it also transformed what the students learned and what they remembered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's a good way of teaching them too, because it's almost hands-on. You literally put yourself in her shoes and you walked basically in her shoes, right? I
Yeah.
mean, in order to really pull from her experiences in the letters, you really had to kind of go through her journey. And I bet it was exciting going back to Japan and kind of seeing Japan in her 1900s or 19th century eyes, and what did it look like and how did she feel? And I mean, did you find that difficult, or was it part of the fun of it?
Fun part, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So in order to write history in a way that's compelling, you have to have an imagination.
yes,
So you have to be able, and this is what historical fiction writers do so well, right? They allow us to feel as though we're living in the worlds that they create. And so it was amazing to me to be able to go back to Japan and even look around modern Tokyo. And
right,
because I'd seen all Tsununo's letters and I'd done all this research, I could see, like literally see the older city that was
right.
the new one.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, I found that personally moving.
Yeah,
Because I think it's one of the reasons that we read, right? We read to get out of our own consciousness and to enter
right.
somebody else's for a little while. It's a kind of respite, especially in times like this. So the feeling of being able to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes, imagine a completely different world and different possibilities for life, was definitely part of the fun of writing the book.
So Mary Lou is asking a question of you, and she asks, have you always enjoyed writing? And if you have, what type of writing?
I have always enjoyed writing. It's true. I wrote ever since I was a kid. I never wrote stories. I never have been a fiction writer, but I did write kind of journals and just, I mean, I remember thinking, and I still have this habit of when I see something like a tree or a coffee shop or whatever it is, the sky, what are the best words to describe this
To
with?
describe it.
Gamey.
Those are really good writing techniques to have. I had a professor that taught me how to think like that. And even artists think like that when they see a tree. You know, how do I draw it? How would I describe it? How would I describe that on paper? Yeah, those are really good thoughts to pass along to would-be writers that are listening.
Yeah, and I
I,
think you know, there's also something about the process of writing, and I think it's true in times like this, especially that when you feel like you can't control the world around you or what is happening to your family or to your city or to your country, you can always control what happens on the page.
right,
And
right.
so it's kind of like an escape into a reality where you set the terms. And if you write, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Like I was writing within bounds. I was writing rule, you know, I had the rules so I couldn't lie, and I was
Mm-hmm.
writing nonfiction, so I had to write about Sununo's life as it happened. But if I had suddenly put on the page and then a bear attacked and ate everybody, you know, that's what happens in that world because you're in
Right,
control of it. And so
right.
I think that that is very appealing too, if you tend to be a kind of control-minded person, to put it
Mm-hmm.
politely, which I think I am.
So Cheryl Ziegler adds, Cheryl's our librarian, and she it just absolutely loves you and was really thrilled that you were here today. And also we want to thank Simon and Schuster
Mhm.
for you know, contacting us and saying Amy would love to do this. So Amy, again, thank you so much. But Cheryl writes a comment, and Cheryl, I absolutely agree. And she says, this is such a great story and a great story about archives, which we talked about. And it's a good illustration of teaching with archives, which is what you're doing with your students. And gee, I wish I was a student again, because I sure would love to be one of yours.
Yeah, well, you can come. You know, we do have we have courses for adults too.
I would love to do that.
About the history of Japan or the early modern world, whichever you.
Oh, I would totally love to do that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And again, I want to encourage those that are here listening to purchase a book at the bookstall in
I'm gonna show it to
Winnetka.
you again. It's called
And there it is.
Logan City, and it came out from Scribner last week, and you can find it at Bookstall
Mhm.
or any place else that sells books, but we
As-
prefer Bookstall.
Yes, A Stranger in the Shogun City. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Amy.
much. I
Go
appreciate
out
it.
and enjoy the rest of the afternoon with your boys. Thank
I
you so
will.
much.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.